Hello, welcome back to Bonaventure Time. I know it's been quite a while since I've released a video, but I have the time now and I'm excited to get back into it. I'm really excited. I really want to make more videos on Hildebrand, more videos on the medievals, and I will get to Aristotle and I'll mention him a little bit today because he will find his way a little bit in today's topic. But today I want to talk about the modern philosophy. The modern era, what are the fundamental problems? What are some things, if there are any things we can take away from modern philosophy? And how does it fit in the context of the history of philosophy? Um, so I think one of the most prominent or faces of modern philosophy, yeah, probably like the face of modern philosophy to a non-philosopher would be Rene Descartes. And right, he's known for many things, and we can already say there is contributions that moderns did make, and that's in the math area, right? And we'll mention more about that. But Descartes in calculus, all these Cartesian methods of math, right? That was big. Hegel as well. Modern symbolic logic, right? So there's this mathematical contribution that they make. Brilliant. But let's back up a little bit. Rene Descartes. He's gonna kick us off. He's gonna start a new way of thought, or seemingly new, on addressing the human person. This is gonna be something that the moderns are really going to tackle, and they're really, as we're going to see, struggle with, is how do you define the human person? How do you look at the human person? And what is the human person? And we're going to see René Descartes in his meditations, he's going to identify a human person as a thinking person. He's very famous for a line, cogito ergo sum, which is Latin for I think, therefore I am. And this is found in his meditations. And in his meditations, Descartes is going to posit what I just said. We are thinking persons. Now, this is true. We do think. We have rational capabilities. But what he is positing in his meditations is something very radical, and I mean that because what he's positing is it's not a person who can think, it is the person as identified as a thinking person, as a cogitan, as he would put it in Latin, right? So he is identifying, how do you define the human person? Thinking. And this is a fundamental error. Why? Because what Descartes is doing is he is confusing human person and nature, right? And he's confusing this nature, right? A person who has a nature, right? Right? You are a person, body, soul, composite, essence, existence, form, matter, act, potency, right? Act and potency. This is the Aristotelian Thomistic view of the human person, right? This is what Descartes is rejecting. And in that, you can see in the scholastic metaphysics a person who has the nature, the active capability, capacity to think, rationalize, right? That is what distinguishes us, as Aristotle would hold, right? And we have this capability to think, but we are not the person itself. What the person is not a thinking person, right? The what and the who, right? And this is a problem, right? Because this has so many fundamental errors for how we regard the human person, right? And in it, right, you're already seeing, as we're seeing, a rejection of Aristotelian Thomistic metaphysics, right? A rejection of Aristotle and how he viewed things in his metaphysics and his physics and his categories, right? And it leads to many problems just outside of philosophy. Even in theology, this becomes a fundamental problem historically for Christology. This would this would wrongfully lead people back into this idea of monophysitism is a heresy. It's that Christ, who is one person, is also only has one nature. It's this whole confusion of person and nature. And what Descartes is doing is following that as well, a little differently in the sense that he's tackling it in a way where he's trying to just reject the Aristotelian metaphysics. And so there's a difference, but it ultimately leads to the same confusion, same problem, heresy. And so this is what Descartes is going to propose, and we're already seeing that the modern's going to, this modern era of philosophy starts with rejecting Aristotelian Thomistic idea of thought. So it rejects ancient philosophy in Aristotle and medieval philosophy in Thomas Aquinas, or at least prominently in Thomas Aquinas. And though there is something interesting, because in many people that I've encountered, when they talk about modern philosophy, it seems that Descartes kind of just, and people following Descartes, they're arbitrary. That what they made up is just simply something completely new and foreign to the world of philosophy. Um, this is not the case. While they are rejecting the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition, what they actually are doing is by saying Aristotle, right? Because for the medieval philosophy, what's the authority? Plato and Aristotle. That's the authority you're looking towards. In the modern, they're going to say, okay, we're not going to look at Plato. We're not going to look at Aristotle. Who are we going to look to? We're going to go further back. We're going to go to the pre-Socratics. Namely, they're going to go to Democritus, Leucippus, and even you're going to see Pythagoras kind of make a revival, right? And you see that in the math. We already mentioned, right, the mathematical contributions. Well, Pythagoras, it was very much, right, the Pythagorean theorem, right? All these things, he was very much into number. He thought everything was number. It was very interesting, right? And we see in these pre-Socratics this idea that there's a fundamental principle that gives account for everything, right? So in a sense, material reductionism, which is going to come forth again in the modern era, right? There's a philosopher named Carl Sagan. He was famous for saying that Carl Sagan is nothing but the sum of the parts that make up Carl Sagan. That might be a little paraphrase, but that the point he's getting across is he's nothing but the sum of his parts, right? This is not what Aristotle would have held. This is something that Democritus would have held, that Leucippus would have held, that Pythagoras would have held, the pre-Socratics, even Empedocles, right? Even a little bit of Anaxagoras, right? This is something that they're going to hold. There's a fundamental principle starting with Thales, right? So this is what the moderns are looking back to. Are we just the sum of our parts? And furthermore, what the pre-Socratics would posit, some of them, was to be this idea of determinism, right? That if we're just the sum of our parts and nothing happens per chance, which is an actual famous saying from pre-Socratic, then human actions can be determined. That we just go along reasonably, that there's no real chance in anything, right? And you're seeing that kind of revival of that in Descartes, in that we are thinking persons, rationality, things happen merely just by reason, right? And there's this confusion of human nature and a person, right? So this is Descartes, and this is a problem, fundamental problems that we've seen arise from it. And modern era is just going to keep adapting this, right? We're going to see this idea of a rejection of natures, that there's nominalism, especially in William of Ockham, that we can't know essences, we can't know natures. You're going to see this pour forth. And by the way, this video is not going to be a whole synthesis. I'm not going to talk about all the philosophers. I'm just going to kind of grab a few and kind of give examples of some of the modern philosophers. So an example of someone rejecting essences, that's going to be Jean-Paul Sartre, who has very rich thought, but he would posit existentialism is a humanism. And so basically his radical existentialism is going to posit that we kind of choose our own essence, that I am not a man, I am not a human, but what I do determines what I am, right? That I choose, in a sense, my essence. So very odd. It's a very radical existentialism. Obviously, again, you see this confusion of human person, and that's really at the heart of the heart of the problem in modern philosophy, is this confusion of what is the human person. You're rejecting the Aristotelian Thomistic idea, right? Namely, we view the human person from without: genus, species, form, matter, existence, essence, act, potency, right, etc. And you're saying, okay, we can't know natures. What is the human person? It's a thinking person, as Descartes would say, or Jean-Paul Sartre would say. We choose. We're not really mankind or anything. We choose what we become, right? Carl Sagan, as I've mentioned, he's more contemporary. Oh, yeah, modern contemporary. He's going to show this idea that we're just the sum of our parts, going back to the pre-Socratics. There's going to be people like Wilson, who's like a biopsychologist. We're going to see people like that who are going to look into this psychology and this biology and use it in philosophy. That's going to be something that comes up in the contemporary, and I kind of want to talk about that, at least get into it a little bit. Right, this idea that another confusion of the human person is determinism. And in this use of psychology and biology, right, they're going to look at that these, what we would call responses, right, a distinguishment between response and reaction. People like Wilson, even Münstenberg, who's a German psychologist, are going to say these are nothing but reactions, right? We just have determined human behavior, right? And you're going to see in the midst of modern philosophy a rise of Newtonian physics. And you might realize that I'm mentioning a lot of sciences like math, biology, psychology, and a lot of these sciences. I know that that's not necessarily philosophy, but this is very important to understand modern philosophy, because this is very much where they develop ideas, and it also can help perhaps save some things from modern philosophy, or save some things we can learn. Because in understanding this psychology that's coming up in determinism, right, you're going to see that in the Newtonian physics, why I bring that up, that is determinism. Because what Newtonian physics at its basis is going to state is that if you can understand all past actions, all past participles, you can predict all outcomes, right? If you understand this past outcome, and then you make the hypothesis, and then you understand the outcome that must necessarily come, right? Cause effect. Then you can, if you take all human actions, all past actions of humans, you can understand all future human actions, right? And it's the sense, the depressing sense of determinism, right? There's no free will, really. There's no chance, right? And this is contemporary, but you're going to see, this is what makes Edith Stein so brilliant. This is what makes Husserl, very good for philosophy. Even Max Scheler, this idea of returning to free will, this idea that, no, like, we're not just determined. Edith Stein's going to tackle that in her philosophy of psychology. It's a brilliant work. Highly recommend it, but she's contemporary. So let's step back into the realm of modern philosophy. Problems, determinism, not understanding person and nature, right? Not understanding the person. Is there a philosopher who we can still learn from? Yes, actually, a lot of them we can still learn from. Descartes had many problems, but another thing in Descartes is, besides the cogito ergo sum, he turns, what's really interesting, he makes a turn to the subject, right? He no longer looks from without, like Aristotle and Thomas, right? This idea of objects, right? Existence, essence, form, matter, I see from without, an abstraction of sorts, right? He's going to turn to the subject to within, right? Consciousness, we're thinking persons. Now, he's going to posit weird ideas like the doxa of belief, like I doubt this, doxa is like illusory in Greek, and for him, this like belief, it's also like the lowest level of knowledge for Aristotle, or sorry, not Aristotle, Plato in his divided line analogy. Descartes would posit this doxa of belief where I can't know reality. I can't prove it. And what he was trying to do was prove that God does exist. But for him, it was like, well, senses lie to me. My sight can lie to me, which is true. But for him, he took it to this radical notion of, well, if it lies to me, then I can only doubt. I can only have this doxa of belief, and I can actually know reality. I can't know if there's reality. That's another fundamental problem. The modern philosophy is this rejection of, I can't know reality. You're going to even see that in Kant, in transcendental idealism. We can only know reality as it presents itself to us, is what Kant would propose. And so Descartes, though, what's interesting, and I want to talk about this, is his turn to the subject actually provides something for philosophy. It's wrong with how he identifies who the human person is, right? But it's interesting because he's going to focus on consciousness, and it's going to lead, as if you watch my other video on Introduction to Phenomenology with Edmund Husserl, to phenomenology in a way, but you're going to see Husserl kind of turn it upside down to move from this doxa of belief to actually reality not only exists, but it actually can exist as a gift. It's a very beautiful thing, especially in care of Wojtyła's or John Paul II's theology of the body. So Descartes actually perhaps provided something, you could say, for philosophy. We could be very generous and say that is something. A turn to the subject is interesting, right? And that's something that was not done in philosophy. So radically done, and he has fundamental problems. But if you look forward to contemporary philosophy, to the growth and the movement of phenomenology and the movement of personalism, a turn to the subject becomes beneficial, because you no longer look from things from without, right? From the Aristotelian tradition, you look from things from within. Now he's going to keep everything from within, to distinguish personalism and phenomenology from Cartesian thought. Is they're going to move from within to without, so they're going to move from the subject to the object. So really what they do is start within the subject to move towards objective reality that Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas would posit. Whereas Descartes would just simply say it all is in here. I can only know what is in here. So that's an interesting thing in philosophy. Immanuel Kant, I mentioned, he still has many fundamental errors in regard to reality and transcendental idealism, which can basically be summed up as I can only know reality as it presents itself to me. So really, we can't. Something commonly mistaken from Kant is many people would say he is an atheist. That's not true. He actually believed there was a God. He actually kind of has his own proof for God. He would kind of beat up on the ontological argument. But he has, in, I believe it's a critique of pure reason, a proof for God. But in his transcendental idealism, what he's saying is we can't know that reality. We can't conclude that reality. I can only know reality concretely as it presents itself to me, as to sight, right? So there's going to be some fundamental errors in his metaphysics. But what can we take from Immanuel Kant? Something I actually respect about him is his notion and emphasis of human freedom. Now, I think it's radical to the extent that he puts freedom almost as an end. And he's still going to have fundamental problems in how he views the human person, even in his ethics. But to give the context, I mentioned Newtonian physics and this determinism. That was around Kant's time, and Kant was very much against determinism. He really did not buy into this depressing idea that we as humans are just determined. So Kant developed, well, I should give you his motto. One of his mottos was, the two things that fill me with awe and wonder are the starry skies above, so aesthetics for him, and then and the moral law within, ethics. His aesthetics is rich, and I won't go into it today. I kind of want to make my own video on his aesthetics because I think there's a lot of beautiful things in there. So perhaps I'll make a separate series on that. But his ethics, moral law within. So this is why he stresses freedom, and he gives man self-autonomy. Now that's a problem, because you're moving the autonomy from God to man, and it's going to develop into this idea of the culture of death, as Pope Benedict would call it, and John Paul II, where we, right in the increasing of modern technology, we look to ourselves first before we look to God. So there is a fundamental problem there. However, his movement to save human freedom provided a lot for philosophy, even though it led to many fundamental errors, right? Because in his ethics, his whole thing is duty, right? Deontology. That is his ethics. Do your duty. Do what any other reasonable man would do, right? And you make a maxim, right? When I determine this law, I am making a maxim law for everyone else because I'm using the faculties that we all share, right? And for him, he's going to reject the will. The will's going to be bad because it desires wrongful things at times. It's deceiving. So it's going to be a stress on the intellectual capabilities, the rational faculties, to make a maxim law for everyone else. And so you see he gives man self-autonomy, and that's a problem. But what he's doing in trying to find, what his goal was to try to find, is that man, because he has the moral law within, has freedom, right? He's not determined. And he would go as far as to say, right, that in his critique of utilitarianism, which is John Stuart Mill, he would go on to say that man cannot be regarded as a means, but must be regarded as an end, as the end in themselves, right? That is interesting. Now, there's something in that is highly provoking in thought, because looking at someone as a means, or not as a means, but as the end. Um, if anyone has ever studied personalism or thought of John Paul II, especially in Love and Responsibility, they're going to know that sounds a lot like the personalistic principle. A personalistic principle has two sides to it, two formulations: the negative and the positive. Negative in the sense of not like it's bad, but doesn't fully illuminate the positive, right? Like there's positive and negative precepts to laws, even like the Ten Commandments. So that's what I mean by negative. The negative formulation is one ought to not be merely the means to an end for another. And merely is a key word. I won't go into this. I will talk about this in another video when I address love and responsibility in itself. But as a means to an end, the positive formulation of personalistic principle is one ought to be loved and affirmed as an end in themselves or for their own sake. For their own sake would be stressed and would be a better formulation of the personalistic principle. But what we see here is something similar to Kant, but there's going to be something different from Kant. Kant is providing that they are the end because they have self-autonomy in the law, the moral law within. As an end in themselves in the personalistic principle, or for their own sake, is not that. It holds autonomy within God, right? God has autonomy, but they simply are not the means, merely a means, but they should be loved for their own sake, namely a human being. This is one of the most beautiful lines from Love and Responsibility. Is something to which the only proper and adequate response is love, right? So love is, so there's this rendering of justice, right? Justice is fully entailed in love, although justice does not fully explain love. There's an interesting formulation there in the Kantian philosophy, in his ethics that you'll see developed in John Paul II. Now, John Paul II is not a Kantian. He critiques it. There's a distinction. That's why I'm kind of settling it there, kind of stating that distinction. So not a Kantian, but Kant certainly did provide something there in maintaining the dignity of the human person and that we are not determined. Now, he still had fundamental errors in metaphysics, so we still was not able to really posit a good philosophy of the human person, wasn't able to really adequately respond to the problems of modern philosophy in Descartes and many others before him. But certainly he provided something in his desire to go against determinism. I will say I admire that, even though I had a professor stress this once, and I agree with it. There are many cases in which Kant wasn't wrong, he just wasn't fully right. And there you can see that, especially in his aesthetics. His ethics, you're going to see some wrong things, right? There are major consequences to rejecting the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. But even then, we're seeing, right, this turn to the subject, this turning to within. There's illuminating things that are going to be advanced in contemporary philosophy that Aristotle did not hit, that Aristotle did not conclude, because you look at man from without. So there's something very interesting there in Kant. To kind of talk more about this modern era, I want to look into this idea of, well, I kind of already mentioned it. Utilitarianism is going to be in the school of thought with John Stuart Mill, and you're going to see John Locke, right? This idea that a maxim of pleasure, again, that's not something new. It's not something arbitrary created. That's going to be in the pre-Socratics and many philosophers in that area in the ancient Greek philosophy, right? This idea of avoiding pain, this sort of hedonistic view, avoiding pain and maximizing pleasure. For John Stuart Mill, utilitarianism is a maximization of pleasure for the greatest amount of people, right? And you're going to see many things. I guess I should talk about this more in depth, because utilitarianism is probably one of the most prominent ethical mindsets adopted in today's society. Many heresies and many false philosophies have subjugated from it. It has Manichaean roots, if you want to take a theological tradition, and it has developed into many other branches like consequentialism, situational ethics, in totalitarianism, which is something very similar, like that if you look at the total outcome, you can justify the means. So like if this was an argument used against Paul VI in Humanae Vitae for allowing contraceptives, right? You look at the total outcome of it, the family will be happy, therapeutic, right? Then you can justify these contraceptives. Now, Paul VI would condemn this in Humanae Vitae. That totalitarianism stems from utilitarianism. Consequentialism is look at the consequences, calculate what would make the greatest outcome, and then choose that good that brings about the most happiness and the most good for everyone. That's consequentialism. There's also teleologism, where you're just looking purely at the end, right? So really at the heart of all these is this idea that the means justify the ends. So right, if I intend it for the right purposes, it's justified. Or sorry, not the means justified. The ends justify the means. Sorry. Right. So that's that idea, and you see that in situational ethics. Great response to that within a philosophical tradition would be Hildebrand in Situation Ethics and Morality, where his critique of it. It's a very unique take to morality because he quotes a lot of literature. It's a very beautiful way. But in a theological tradition, and for Catholics, magisterial teachings upon this is condemned by John Paul II in Veritatis Splendor. I believe that was 1991 or 93, that condemns consequentialism and all forms of utilitarianism. Utilitarianism is like majorly combated with the personalistic view from John Paul II in Love and Responsibility. So that's a very brief. That really doesn't do justice to John Locke and John Stuart Mill. Partly because Stuart Mill, I will say, is not one of my favorite philosophers, but he wasn't stupid. He wasn't dumb. He was very brilliant. So that very brief. I hope that doesn't make it sound like Mill's not smart. He was. Just his whole utilitarianism is indeed something woefully wrong, but appealing, right? Appealing because, right, if you look to situational ethics, which kind of stems from utilitarianism, totalitarianism, you're going to see this mindset, right, of having sympathy, and this is very interesting, Hildebrand would comment upon this, having sympathy for the tragic sinner, right? It's this idea of looking at the self-righteous or the Pharisee and seeing how woefully wrong they are, but looking at the tragic sinner, though he is sinning, he's trying. And this pity, right, something that Aristotle would say is a great fundamental opposer to reason, pity. This pity for the tragic sinner makes you root for him more than self-righteous. It makes you realize, okay, actually, I'd rather focus on the tragic sinner. And if I'm focusing on the tragic sinner, then maybe because he's sinning, even though he's sinning, even though he's sinning, he's still a good man. So maybe, just maybe, there are some cases in which I can sin, or in philosophy, moral philosophy, maybe I can do something unreasonable for the sake of bringing about a great end, right? Because you're having this, starting with this pity for the tragic sinner, and then it moves to this glorification of the sinner, and it moves to this compromisation of the natural law, right? So utilitarianism and totalitarianism, that was like a brief, 200 years of philosophy right there. But it's very appealing for the human mindset because, right, if you don't want to be virtuous, if you don't want to practice virtue, if you want to just be lax or mediocre, right, that's appealing because it gives you the minimum amount of what you need to do for the law and in regards to the law. So utilitarianism is a problem, and it ought to be studied because good critiques should be formulated against it, and good critiques are out there. But John Stuart Mill, it has to be understood, he wasn't dumb. So if you met up with someone who is very well versed into the Stuart Mill thought, they're not going to be dumb. And you still need to make adequate philosophy to combat this way of thought. And so that's why it is also important to look at the moderns, is because, right, these fundamental errors we see in them, you still need to combat. They're not stupid, right? Because they didn't make something arbitrary. That's a common mistake. Is people think they just came up with something completely new. They're going back to the pre-Socratics. They're going back to, right, again, Leucippus and Democritus, right? And what they're doing is they're developing a very smart account of this. They're building off of it. They had a foundation to build off of. So you have to be really well versed in your philosophy, in ancient Greek, in medieval, in contemporary, right, to combat these ways of thought. But as we've seen, there's still some things we can take and pull from them. Another this I know this is a longer video because this is like the modern era of philosophy, so it's not just one philosopher. So this is going to be a little longer. But another school of thought I really want to look to in the modern era. I know I'm not getting into like Spinoza and Leibniz, and Kierkegaard, who I think is actually just worthy of his own video, so perhaps I'll do that. So I'm missing a lot. Rousseau, I guess I'm naming them, but I guess I won't go into detail in their philosophy. Pascal, right. So Rousseau's interesting. I kind of actually want to talk about him. Interesting modern. He thought that man's goal, society, was this evil construct, and so we should go back to our most primitive realities. Man is happiest when he's animalistic. Now that sounds crazy. But I will say there's some things in Rousseau that if I was not Catholic and if I was not adhering to the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition and personalistic tradition, it's I don't know, it's kind of appealing to read Rousseau. I don't know. There's something about it. I don't know. It's a crazy way of thought. It's not stupid. He gives good arguments, but yeah, he's an interesting one. There's Karl Marx. He's insane, again, but not stupid, but insane. That he has interesting sociological looks, and psychological looks. And again, there's a huge connection between psychology and philosophy, especially in the modern and contemporary area. But he, at the heart of it, if you looked at his sociological theory, is this conflict theory, and right, he's communistic, right, Marxists. But in a sociological standpoint, you're gonna see that it's this conflict theory. There's like three major theories in sociology. There's fundamental option theory. There's symbolic interactionist theory, and then conflict theory. And conflict theory would look at something. If you use the analogy of marriage, right, fundamental option theory would look at a marriage in the eyes that everyone has their role to play, and you bring to table like complementary personalities, right? So you have the role of the I'm thinking so much in psychology terms, but you have the role of, say, like providing for the family, doing this sort of chores, right, according to your talents and gifts, whereas the wife has these sort of roles according to her talents and gifts. That's kind of how fundamental option theory would look, and it's very much a Catholic view in sociology, right? Lumen Gentium would talk about the church and the different roles everyone has to play, right? We're not all the same. So personally, I adhere to the fundamental option theory in sociology. Then there's the symbolic interactionist theory, where it almost looks as if everyone's an actor. So there's just basically a role that you adhere to. It's almost kind of deterministic. That is one I do not adhere to. Interesting things you can take from it, though. And then there's conflict theory, where it's this fight for power. That's what Marx is really going to emphasize. He would emphasize it certainly for marriage, but you're going to see that in his philosophy, political philosophy especially, and communism as well. So really bad, but this idea that everything's a thirst for power. Now, there are some interesting notes that he makes in regard to the human person, especially if he's appealing to the psychology of man, to the psyche, where it is true, where there are things in man of distorted desires, but I think he doesn't make a distinction between distortion and the ontology of evil, right? The evil that has no ontology. But again, a lot of moderns would posit, they wouldn't say that explicitly, but implicitly, certainly they do, and that comes as a consequence from rejecting Thomistic metaphysics and Aristotle. And you see a Manichaeanism in that, right? Because Manichaeans held that there's a good God and there's an evil God and they're fighting for power, right? That conflict theory right there, right? Star Wars actually has that at its basis, kind of, where it's right. The as soon as the light rises, dark rises to meet it. So a very flawed way of looking at good and evil and giving evil ontology. That is something that conflict theory in sociology doesn't always presuppose, but a lot of conflict theorists would usually adhere to that kind of way of thought. So there's Karl Marx. He's worthy of mentioning in the sense that communism is still a problem and was a big problem. And it's, again, studying these ways of thought and building in philosophy to reject and to combat these ways of wrong philosophy is a very good thing, and is a responsibility that actually, as Catholic philosophers, we ought to do, and Catholic theologians as well. So that's Karl Marx. Another school of thought, though, I want to mention. I know I've kind of just splurting this out. This is me. The reason why I wanted to make this video is because I just love to just think about the history of philosophy and kind of just splurt out just a bunch of philosophers and kind of talk about them. Not really going in depth. You might have noticed I'm not really going deep into the way of thought, but I love just talking about it and seeing continuity. That's why I love the history of philosophy, right? You can see the continuity of thought and seeing just kind of like putting a puzzle together. So that's why this is a little longer and not necessarily focusing on one philosophy. But another big movement in modern philosophy would be especially in Berkeley and Hume. Berkeley and Hume. That's going to be radical empiricism, and it's this idea that, right, that's just very much into the scientific method that, right, Kant's going to say we can only know what appears to us. Descartes' going to say I can't know really anything, the doxa of belief. You're going to have Hume and Berkeley in this empiricism, radical empiricism, say, well, if I can't test it, I can't know it's true, and it's not true, right? Then that's the mindset in today for science. Sciences have lost their dignity today, and that might be bold of me to say, but it's true, right? They have lost their esteemed role they play in providing knowledge and contributing to man's intellectual pursuits. And they've vastly reduced themselves, especially physicists. But yeah, this idea that if you can't test it, it's not true. So Hume would even reject, this is major consequences in theology. Hume would reject miracles because they break the order of nature for him. You can't test them, right? You see it Christologically in the history of Christology, right? This separation of Jesus of Nazareth from the Christ of faith. That I can't believe I forgot his name, but there's this man who started this movement in theology that we need to demythologize Christ. So he take away the Christ of faith and just focus on the Jesus of Nazareth, right? Radical exegesis, historical critical exegesis. So that's the mindset that Hume would have. He wasn't a theologian in that aspect of where he would really delving into Christology in that perspective, but he certainly would actually make arguments that there is no God, there can't be miracles, right? If God is all powerful, then how does he allow evil, right? That's a big question even nowadays. So that's the consequence of his radical empiricism. And it was, honestly, Hume is one of my least favorite philosophers. And that's not just saying, I'm not just saying that because of the claims he makes against God. Certainly I abhorred those as a Catholic philosopher, but he kind of just demeans philosophy in itself, right? Because philosophy, the distinction between philosophy and science is science gives probabilities. Philosophy gives absolute conclusions, right? Hume, in limiting philosophy to just empiricism, to what we can test, is limiting himself to the scientific method to where philosophy becomes probabilities. And I have major issues with that. I praise St. John Henry Newman for his combatants against Hume. Not combatants, that's not a word. For his combats against Hume, that's the right word. in his defense of miracles and the phenomenal nature of them. Um, Hume's not my favorite. I'm not gonna lie. He's not one of my favorites. Um, but that's a huge way of thought, and you certainly see that prevalent today in society in this radical empiricism. So as we're looking at this modern philosophy, right, we're really seeing that there are some deep fundamental errors. Sure, there are many things we can take away, especially in math. There's that. There's Hegelian logic, even though he was deeply into subjectivism, right? And so as a personalist, we make a distinction between subjectivity, distinct from Descartes' subjectivity. We would look at that more as subjectivism, and Hegel would certainly follow subjectivism. And personalists would refer to subjectivity as the interiority of man, namely his pursuit of truth and good in an objective reality within the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. But Hegel would follow subjectivism, so you really see these major flaws in them. They certainly were brilliant. They contributed a lot in the mathematical area and just to science in general. But you really, at the heart of it, and we saw this, I think it's clear that we can see this going through this video, they just couldn't understand the human person. And they contributed certain things that would help contemporaries make good observations and conclusions about the human person and advances, but they couldn't really understand the human person. And that was a major consequence of rejecting the Aristotelian tradition. You can't. I mean, you just can't reject scholasticism in their metaphysics. So that's kind of the modern era. That's where they fit, right? They're not arbitrary. They come from this pre-Socratic idea of determinism and mechanism, or atomism, in Democritus. But what's interesting is Copleston in his History of Philosophy kind of reflects on this, and you'd even see something a little similar in Etienne Gilson in his History of Philosophy. Moderns, they were coming. Like, it was clear that they were coming. Why? Because, and Copleston remarks this, and it's very interesting, and I think he actually has something there, is in the late medieval, even in Aquinas and especially in Duns Scotus, into the early Renaissance and the late Renaissance, right, and Suarez, it's complex. Philosophy came overly complex. In their terminology, they started pondering things that it became very abstract. Now, Aquinas was not as much guilty as this as I think Duns Scotus was, but even in his scholastic philosophy, especially his scholastic followers, they definitely were guilty of that. And so the moderns, what their place in philosophy was to simplify things. Now, that came at the cost of rejecting a lot of things and having a lot of fundamental errors, as we saw, but they really wanted to simplify things, and they were necessary in that aspect, and it led to the way for some neo-scholastics, such as Jacques Maritain, who's brilliant, right? Etienne Gilson, brilliant. He's kind of just a philosopher, is what he would say. He just loved a lot of anyone who contributed to truth. He loved. And then contemporaries like Husserl and Edith Stein, Jean Paul II, Arcade Wojtyla, Dietrich von Hildebrand, right? So many great thoughts. Right, so the simplification of philosophy would lead to good things, right? Even for the Thomist, who was rejected in the Aristotelian, right, by the moderns, they would find some fruits in this simplification, even though it was wrong, and they would right that wrong. They would return to the Aristotelian Thomistic tradition. That was something Scheler was good at, returning to virtue ethics, right? Jacques Maritain and Dietrich von Hildebrand, a return to scholastic metaphysics. So really, there's a lot of errors, but we see why they happened. And I'm not justifying the moderns by saying they simplified things, but that's certainly showing, in a sense, they were necessary and why they happened. Again, not justifying what their fundamental errors were, but they were coming, and it was clear that they were coming, and they led to a great era in philosophy, the moderns, or not the moderns, the contemporaries, the postmodern era in philosophy, and there's a lot of great things, right? I myself love the personalist tradition, And it's really more of a movement than a tradition, which is something I also say. It's not doctrinal like Thomism or Aristotelian thought. It's a movement as well as phenomenology, I would argue as well. But it's certainly right. You see things like that lead into Husserl and Stein, and I believe I talk about that in both of the videos I've made of them. So that's modern philosophy for you. I know this wasn't really like diving deep into someone's thought, and maybe you were looking for that. If you want deep diving into one of their thoughts, just comment and I'll make a video on whatever philosopher you want. As long as I know about them in depth, I won't speak about them if I don't know about them. But yeah, so I just comment if you want more. But this is more just the history of philosophy and kind of where the moderns fit in their thought and what we can think about them. So I hope you enjoyed this. I know it was longer, but please leave a like and subscribe if you liked it. God bless.